Okay. All right, everyone. Well, it's good to see you again. Make sure everybody's muted. Just a second here. Okay, there we go. All right, everyone. It's great to see you again. We are here on Wednesday night. Obviously, we couldn't do it Tuesday. I appreciate everyone being flexible. I had to move my mom into assisted living yesterday. So yesterday was one of the most hellacious days I've had in my life, but we got it done. Anyway, so here we are on Wednesday night. We really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Well, anyway, just a little bit about myself. I'm Eric Chabot. I'm the director. As you know, we have a couple apologetic chapters here one at The Ohio State University, one at Columbus State Community College here in Columbus, Ohio. And as you know, we've been doing these Zoom calls because a lot of people, obviously we haven't been able to go on campus and do our equipping there. So we've just been doing these Zoom calls for now, and they've been going pretty well. So tonight we have a special guest. We have a friend of mine named Jonathan. Jonathan, this is embarrassing, but I've only met you once in person, but do you say it McLatchie or McLatchie?
McLatchie.
McLatchie. Okay, I had it right. Yay, I'm right. Okay. So we have Jonathan McLatchie with us. I met Jonathan a number of years ago at a apologetics conference in Charlotte, but I knew who he was before that because I started seeing Jonathan's name pop up on blog posts and online, and when he was just starting to get going, and that was a number of years ago. So Jonathan has really carved out a name, doing good work for the Lord and just out there doing all kinds of stuff. I really knew him to begin with, like from his science background. I read a lot of his science stuff, and then Jonathan has ventured out. He's done a lot of debates with Muslims all over the world. He's done debates with atheists. He also hosts the Apologetics Academy, right? Apologetics Academy, right, where he has guests on, all kinds of guests. I mean, not even just believers, like skeptics and atheists, and they talk about different sides of the arguments. And so, you want to check out some of his videos on there. He's got some excellent guests on there where they cover both sides of the argument. But Jonathan has actually a couple of master's degrees already and a PhD. Jonathan, what are your master's degrees in and your PhD? And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure. I have a master's in evolutionary biology and systematics and another master's in medical and molecular bioscience. And my PhD is in evolutionary biology.
Wow. Okay. That's a handful. And Jonathan's actually working on another master's degree in biblical studies at my seminary. I went to Southern Evangelical Seminary, and he's a professor just outside Boston. Let's get the name of the school again, Jonathan. How do you say it?
It's Sattler College in Boston.
Okay. And so Jonathan has just taken a job there over the last year, and he's newly married. And so, Jonathan, you're from Scotland or Ireland or England?
Scotland, that's right.
Scotland, that's right, Scotland. Okay. I've only met Jonathan once in person, so I don't know everything about him. I've tried to remember every single thing I can. But anyway, we're so happy to have Jonathan with us tonight. He is a wealth of knowledge about a lot of topics. So I just thought tonight what we would do is focus on one area. I mean, obviously we could go over many topics, Islam or something else. We've had David Wood on, some other topics. But the issue tonight that we want to focus on is the issue of intelligent design, the topic of creation and evolution, which you're a specialist in. And so just a little bit about our apologetics ministry. We really don't take a stand on a specific creation model. Obviously, we believe God created everything, but we're not really dogmatic about, what is the right, about whatever your creation model is. We're flexible. But as a ministry, we do think there's problems like theistic evolution, evolutionary creationism, as I'm sure you're familiar with. And so, but we do use a lot of intelligent design arguments in our ministry, and I've used those over the years and read a fair amount of literature, but I'm by no means an expert like you. So why don't you go ahead and first tell us how you got interested in the topic of intelligent design, biology, and all that stuff? What got you going in that direction?
Sure. So I began my undergraduate studies in 2007 at Strathclyde University and was blown away by the wonders of the world of the cell, especially the engineering prowess and genius of molecular machines and the information storage, processing, and retrieval apparatus that governs the show in biology. And in fact, I was often rather bewildered that people could study biology for 4 years at a college level and come out atheist at the other end, because the evidence for design seemed to really stand out from what I was learning in the life sciences. And I later also came to realize just how strong the evidence of design also is in the physical sciences, from the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of the universe, and so forth. And so it provides, and so I think design has not only great explanatory power, explaining the observations that I've seen in the life sciences, but also has the explanatory scope of explaining observations across multiple disciplines, both the life sciences as well as the physical sciences. And so I ended up working for a year at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, between 2012 and 13. I'd also done a month's internship over a summer during my undergraduate degree, and just got really interested in developing these arguments for design in biology.
That's great. So would you say, now you say for you though, you're studying it just seems so overwhelming to you that there was some sort of obviously creator designer behind all that and other people weren't seeing that. So why don't you just give a little synopsis of when we say intelligent design or using intelligent design arguments, what is that? And how's it different from like saying I'm a young earth creationist or an old earth creationist? Like what is the difference in that? What are they doing with that?
Well, intelligent design is a scientific proposition which is not wedded to a particular stance that one might take on interpreting the early chapters of Genesis. It's in its purest sense, it's completely agnostic on the age of the Earth. That's a separate, independent question. And so it's kind of, you can think of it as kind of a big tent or umbrella, under which you might find young Earth creationists as well as old Earth creationists. People who are not convinced by the power of stochastic, unguided processes of chance and physical necessity to account for the complexity and design that we see in life. So creationism is really concerned with ontology, what is the source of being, whereas intelligent design is concerned with, or is the quest for signs of patterns or hallmarks of intelligence in the world. And it's basically, intelligent design is basically based on two criteria, both of which have to be met in order to warrant an inference to design. And those are complexity and specification. So complexity relates to the improbability of an event happening by chance. But we know that there are many chance occurrences which are enormously improbable. So just the fact that it is highly enormously improbable does not necessarily warrant a design inference. And of course, improbability must always be measured with respect to the probabilistic resources that are available. So for example, if you imagine an ATM machine and you plug in your bank card to the ATM machine, well, and you've got four digit PIN number, and there's the digits on the ATM machine of 0 to 9, then how many possible ways are there of dialing in a 4-digit number? Well, there's 10 digits of 0 to 9, and there's 4 numbers you have to key in. So that would be 10,000 or 10 to the 4th power of possible ways of dialing in a 4-digit number. But we know that only one of those numbers is specific to your bank card. And if you imagine that the bank gives you 3 trials before it locks you out of your account, and that would correspond to what we call the probabilistic resources, right? The number of opportunities you have to get the right PIN number. And so if you have only 3 trials and you're just randomly guessing PIN numbers, then is it more likely or less likely than not that you will, by chance, guess the right PIN number? Well, obviously, it's overwhelmingly more likely that you'll fail and not succeed in guessing the right PIN number by chance. And so, but if you have 10,000 trials, of course, then it becomes much more probable. So improbability always relates to the available probabilistic resources. So then there's also the specification, which basically means the conformity to some independently given pattern. So in the analogy I gave with the ATM machine, the 4-digit PIN number, which was specific to your bank card, is not only an enormously improbable number, because it's not any more improbable than any other random 4-digit number, but it also conforms to some independently given pattern. So if someone walks up to the ATM machine and dials in the right number, you have a warrant for inferring that they're not simply guessing by chance the correct PIN number, but they actually know the correct PIN number, and the success of dialing in the correct PIN number is the result of design. So these are the 2 criteria by which one would warrant a design inference: complexity and specification. And it differs from creationism in that where it's not derivative from some interpretation of scripture or the early chapters of Genesis, but rather is based purely on the scientific evidence.
Okay, so would you say intelligent design is more interested in dealing with the stronghold that like methodological naturalism has in the science, and intelligent design is really getting a little more into philosophy of science with that issue than dealing with the philosophy issues like the presuppositions that the natural world is all there is and we can only look for natural causes? Is it trying to put a dent in that, even though it's not against natural causation? But I mean, is it trying to kind of put a little dent in that and give another alternative?
Yeah, it does call into question the naturalistic worldview, and of course, evolution is the most consistent way to be a naturalist. Evolution by natural selection is the best chance that you have of sustaining a naturalistic worldview, and of course, intelligent design challenges that. So intelligent design calls that into significant question.
And the other thing that I've noticed is you're very clear about the two criteria for saying something. You can infer that there's a designer behind some feature of the natural world, is that it's complexity and specification. So a lot of times you're talking about God's existence with people. I've watched students talk to others and other dialogues. A lot of times they'll say, well, one of the reasons I think God exists is because everything's just too complex. Let's say that a lot. Everything's just so complex. The world, the universe. That's kind of vague to some people. I mean, I know what they're trying to say, but you're saying you have to have this issue of specification to make that argument work. You need to get more specified. Like you have to bring in the specificity issue. Yeah. Can you kind of elaborate that again? Like maybe apply that to like the fine tuning of the universe. Like how would that work with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think people that say that the universe and life are just so complex, although it's not philosophically or it's not philosophically nuanced to argue that way. I think that people who say that actually what they mean is specified complexity. It's just inarticulate.
Right.
But in terms of the fine tuning of the universe, to give an example, so we know physicists have shown that many of the constants and laws of our universe are finely balanced on a razor's edge for life to exist. Not just life as we know it, but life of any form existing anywhere, anytime in our universe. So, for example, if the cosmological constant, which determines how rapidly the universe expands, were to vary, the usual value that's given in the literature is 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, then either matter would expand so rapidly that you would only ever get the two largest elements of hydrogen and helium, or you get a big charge scenario within picoseconds of the Big Bang because of gravity. And so you've got a huge level of fine tuning there. Another example was discovered by Roger Penrose, who's actually not a theist, but an agnostic mathematical physicist at Oxford University, which is the initial low entropy conditions of our universe. And according to him, if the initial the probability of attaining the initial low entropy conditions of our universe varied, the probability is 1 in 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123rd power. So on the denominator, there is a 1 with 10 to the power of 123 zeros after the 1, which is more zeros after the 1 than subatomic particles in the known universe. So you wouldn't even have enough subatomic particles to write down a number so big. And then there's the ratio of the strong weak nuclear force, et cetera. So there's the gravitational constant. So there's lots of parameters and constants that have been documented by physicists. Dr. Luke Barnes wrote a book on this called A Fortunate Universe, which is very much worth reading. And so the way that I would start the argument is as follows: that it's not wildly improbable that on the hypothesis of classical theism, God would create a universe in which intelligent life forms can exist, because God is perfectly good, and you can see some moral value in God creating a moral arena. So it's, even if it's not probable on theism, it's not wildly improbable on theism. However, it is wildly improbable on atheism that you would get a finely tuned universe that is inhabited by conscious, sentient observers such as ourselves. And so, therefore, the the existence of such sentient, conscious, moral beings such as ourselves is strong evidence that is confirmatory of the proposition of theism. Because really, when you're evaluating evidence, you're looking at a ratio of two probabilities. That is, the probability of your the probability of your evidence existing given your hypothesis is correct, versus the probability of that same evidence existing given that your hypothesis is wrong. And the evidence that we're evaluating when it comes to the fine-tuning of the universe is the specification of the constants and laws of the universe for life of any form to exist anywhere at any time. And it's not simply that they're improbable, because any other set of constants and laws, any other value that those laws took, would be equally improbable. But it also conforms to this independently given pattern, namely the constants and values that are necessary for life to exist. And so some people have tried to argue that there could be some underlying physical principle that means that the laws and constants just have to be the way they are, and they couldn't have varied. And so that would undermine the design warrant or inference. However, that would just, I think, shift the problem back a step, because then you would still ask the question, well, why is it that the underlying physical principle makes the constants of our universe just have to be that which is conducive to life? And so it just shifts the problem back a step. And so the most promising candidate explanation for explaining the fine-tuning is the so-called multiverse, which is an incarnation of the chance hypothesis. But it's also fraught with problems and difficulties. For example, it's not just any multiverse that would be required to explain the fine-tuning that would be sufficient to explain the fine-tuning. You need a certain type of a multiverse, namely a multiverse in which all the constants vary. And so even if you have an infinite number of parallel universes, it's not guaranteed that you'll have all a probabilistic space that is sampled, right? And secondly, it has to be based on the same physics in order to be relevant to the fine-tuning problem of our universe. And also you run into the so-called Boltzmann brain problem, which is that it's far more probable that you would get a small patch of order where you get a single brain fluctuating into existence out of the quantum vacuum. And that seems to be more probable than that you get a finely tuned universe and the complex life that we observe in our universe. So that's kind of a synopsis of the basics of the fine-tuning argument.
Okay, so let's go into evolution a little bit. So when I talk about evolution with people and they're so dogmatic about it, the ones that are, I always, get them to define evolution, because as you know, there's many different definitions of evolution. And there isn't just one. I mean, from what I see, there's like 6, 7, 8. Do you mean random mutation, natural selection causing the whole complexity of life? Do you mean common descent? Do you mean, you're talking about the origin of life, like chemical evolution? Are you talking about, this kind of evolution, or that blind watchmaker hypothesis? I mean, what do you mean by evolution? And that really, I don't want to sound condescending or arrogant. That just throws a lot of people off. Like they don't know there's that much variety and definition of different kinds of evolution. So when I bring up the fine-tuning argument, I always say that even to get evolution going on Earth, even to get to the biological phase, like Darwinian biological evolution, you have to have the right universe, the right planet. Then you have to show how life can come from non-life, which we still don't know. As James Torr came to our campus this past fall and showed us we're no further along our origin of life studies. And so before you even get to biological evolution, you've got to get those 3 steps done. Do you think that's an adequate way to deal with talking to people about that? Do you think that strategically speaking, when they bring up evolution?
To talk about the origins of life, I think.
No, I mean, like when they start arguing over evolution, first get them to define it correctly,
right, sure.
and then bring up the issue that they need those components. You need
right.
those things in place before you even jump to Darwinian evolution, right?
Yeah, so the evolution really, as you said, is a slippery term, and there's different meanings that people might be intending by the term evolution. And really, the theory of evolution consists of 6 main components. You have the change in allele frequencies in a population over time, which is an allele is simply a gene variant, and then you have and of course that's uncontroversial. It's incontroversial that the frequencies of gene variants in the population change over time, and that can be driven by selection. It can also be driven by what's called random genetic drift, which is when you don't have the population's sizes that are necessary for natural selection to be effective, and the population literally drifts, and you get it's a random and near-random process, and you get gene variants, even if they're not necessarily advantageous, which just by chance end up becoming fixed and becoming established in the population. Then there's the idea of speciation, which is also uncontroversial, which is to say that you might have a population and individuals within that population split apart and end up becoming separated by, let's say, a geographical barrier. And so they're no longer able to interbreed with one another. And over time, these two subpopulations change so much as they're driven by different environmental pressures that they're no longer able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring, and now they're considered different species. So that's the idea of speciation. And then there's the idea of common ancestry, which is to say that all organisms alive today are descended with modification from common ancestors, such that if you wind the tape of life back sufficiently far, you will come to a single universal progenitor of all life that exists today. So you and a chimpanzee and a giraffe and a banana and the fungus growing in the back of your foot, they're all descended with modification from common ancestors. So that's widely agreed upon today among biologists, that and really that idea actually wasn't new with Darwin, right? You can find that idea, that concept going right back to the ancient Greeks. So that wasn't really Darwin's fundamental contribution to biology. There's also, of course, the idea of gradualism, the idea that evolution takes place very gradually over hundreds of thousands, even millions, hundreds of millions of years. And so it doesn't happen by sudden leaps and bounds, but happens very slowly over long periods of time. And then there's natural selection. And this really was Darwin's fundamental contribution to biology, was the idea that natural selection, coupled with chance variations that arise in the population, can account for the appearance of design without recourse to a designing intelligence. And so natural selection basically preserves the combination of gene variants that help the organism to reproduce in its environment and to produce fertile offspring. And that's also uncontroversial. There's numerous instances that could be discussed that are published on the efficacy of natural selection. For example, you'll have heard of antibiotic resistance and insecticide resistance, which arises by natural selection, where you have when you apply an antibiotic to a group of microorganisms, then those bacteria which are susceptible to the antibiotic will die, and those organisms which just by chance happen to carry some resistance to the antibiotic will survive, and then because all their competitors have died, then those now have no competition, and so they become so that phenotype becomes the dominant in the population, and now all the organisms have the antibiotic resistance gene. So that's how natural selection operates. And then finally, we've got the idea of random genetic mutation. And random genetic mutations were not known in Darwin's time. He just knew about chance variations that appear in the population. But now we understand that the evolution is driven by these genetic copying errors that arise while the DNA is being copied. Sometimes the DNA polymerase might make an error, and usually it's a neutral error. It's neither positive or negative, and that accounts for about 3/4 of mutations that arise. They're usually neutral, neither advantageous or deleterious. And then the next most frequent type of mutation are the deleterious mutations, which cause some harm to the organism, and these are purged from the population by what's called purifying selection, which eliminates them from the gene pool, because they result in a disadvantage to the organism carrying it, and so it's no longer able to or it carries a disadvantage in terms of its survival. And then there's very rare cases where you have advantageous mutations, but although the advantageous mutations are rare, they nonetheless end up becoming dominant in population, because natural selection preserves those and results in their becoming fixed or becoming dominant in the population. So these are the different meanings that the evolution can have. And really, as an ID theorist, the point of contention for me, the key point of contention for me is the sufficiency of random genetic mutations and natural selection to explain and account for the complexity and design of living systems. So as I said earlier, the idea of common ancestry is not something that was new with Darwin, right? You can trace that back to the ancient Greeks. Darwin's contribution was that selection coupled with variation could explain the appearance of design without recourse to a designer. Now, when you read a lot of the evolutionary popular literature, such as Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True, or Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, virtually all of their time is spent defending the idea of common ancestry. But that wasn't what Darwin, that wasn't the key selling point of Darwin's theory. The key selling point was that you could explain away design without needing a designer. But demonstrating the proposition of descent with modification or hereditary continuity doesn't really do that, right? You can still have strong evidence for design, even if you have this material continuity from a single common ancestor to everything that we see around us today. So there's this equivocation error that's often made between what I call pattern versus process. Pattern would be the pattern that we observe of descent with modification from common ancestors, and the process would be the mechanism that we invoke to explain that pattern. And demonstrating the former, that is the pattern, doesn't demonstrate the latter, doesn't demonstrate the process.
That certainly was a lot. It's very good, helpful definitions, very technical as well. So then what is it that you would, out of all those definitions of evolution, let's take a step further, even though I don't want to, and we're trying to stay in the intelligent design arena. I see your problem is the intelligent design challenge is the fact that to say actually undirected natural processes can account for the complexity and the design of life is just, it's just not, the evidence isn't there, whether it be in the cell, looking at the way the cell functions or the biological information, whatever it is, it's just not, the evidence isn't there. So, but what out of all those definitions you just gave, what problems would those bring to the issue of Christian theology, biblical theology? Like, we know common descent. There's a big debate ongoing about Adam and Eve and all those debates. There's plenty of books that are being written about it right now, all those issues. So what would problems would this create for biblical theology? I mean, I can't go too much into Genesis, like all the different texts, but just in general, like what, I mean, and then maybe can you kind of expand why some Christians are trying to harmonize the two and they're calling themselves like evolutionary creationists or theistic evolutionists and some of the problems with those terms?
Yeah, so I have significant problems with the proposition of theistic evolution. And my problem is not so much a theological one as it is a straightforward logical one. And that is that not even God can direct a process which by definition is undirected. Because to the extent that evolution is theistic, it's not Darwinian. And to the extent it's Darwinian, it's not theistic. Because the whole point of Darwin's theory is that it explains away the appearance of design. So not even God can direct or guide an unguided process. And it's just a logical problem. Furthermore, in terms of theological problems, if you're committed to the gradualistic scenario that is neo-Darwinian evolution, then it becomes very difficult to see how you can still sustain the idea of an historical literal, because according to the evolutionary school of thought, there was never any first human, right? In the same way that, here's a thought experiment to help illustrate. Imagine, how many facial hairs does it take on a human face to qualify as having a beard, right? Is it the case that you add one more hair and now you have a beard, whereas previously you didn't? Well, no. It's something that happens very gradually over time. There's never a hair that contributes or causes a man to go from having no beard to having a beard. But we all recognize a beard when we see one. And likewise, we all recognize a human being when we see one, but according to the evolutionary school of thought, there was never any first human in the same way. That it's a very gradual process. It's populations change very gradually, and eventually, after many thousands of generations, you would arrive at what we now consider to be a human being. but this, I think, runs contrary to the biblical notion that there was a definite point at which mankind arose and that they were brought into being by a supernatural cause rather than evolving naturally and gradually over long periods of time. Now, I personally, and I realize there might be some disagreement among the audience, I'm not sure, but I personally think that you can harmonize Adam and Eve with the idea of common ancestry, provided you are not committed to the idea of gradualism and neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory. And the reason is that once you start to move away from the gradualistic scenario, then the boundary line between special creation and common descent starts to become rather blurred. If God were to bring into, I mean, Genesis 1 is very vague on how exactly God brings new forms of life into being. I mean, in fact, it says, speaking about the land animals, let the earth bring forth living creatures after their kind, right? So, I mean, it's very vague as to how exactly God brings about living organisms. But if God were to bring about one type of organism using as a template or a blueprint a previous form of organism and do so very, very suddenly, not gradually, then I think the boundary line between special creation and common descent becomes rather blurred at that point. And you could even say that there was a point where God took a previous non-human animal and did something supernatural, so to suddenly change them into a human being, or did something, infuse information into the biosphere somehow in some sense, perhaps into the egg cell or something, we don't know. But it's at least conceivable that God could have used a process like that to bring into being a new form of life very suddenly from a previous existing one, even a human with the imago Dei, the image of God, from a previous non-human organism. I don't necessarily have a theological problem with that. And the view I would tend to lean towards on Adam and Eve, although I'm not dogmatic on it and I'm open to discussion on it, is what I call a tribal representative view of Adam and Eve. Namely, that Adam and Eve were real people and that there was a literal fall, but they weren't necessarily the only human beings alive at the time. In fact, there were certain clues in the Genesis narrative. For example, in Genesis 4, where Cain is having murdered Abel, is concerned that someone will find him and kill him, and so God has a mark placed on him to protect him. That seems to imply, I mean, it's not conclusive, but it seems to suggest that, or at least allow for the possibility that there are other humans alive at the time. He also, Cain builds a city, which also suggests that there are other people around at the time. It answers the age-old question of where Cain got his wife. Now, I understand the solution that maybe he married his sister or something along those lines, but that's not indicated explicitly in the text. It's just kind of taken for granted in the Genesis narrative that, you know, Cain married and he found a wife. So there are certain clues that are at least consistent in the Genesis narrative of there being other people alive at the time, and one could, in principle, I think, uphold the idea of Adam and Eve as the first priest and priestess of humanity, that they are tribal representatives of their community. I would reject, however, the view that's popularized by some, including John Walton and Joshua Swamidass and others, that Adam and Eve, although they were real people, they lived very recently and only after numerous generations of humans had already existed. I think that it's very difficult to account for original sin under such a view. But on my view, I think where Adam and Eve were among the first people, but not the only first people, I think that you can account for, you can still sustain a robust view of original sin. So in terms of Adam and Eve themselves, I think it's conceivable, and this is where I think Joshua Swamidass actually has it right, is where he makes this distinction between the genealogical ancestry and genetic ancestry. So he argues that you could have Adam and Eve created in the way that Genesis 2 states, where in the most face value reading, where Adam is created from the dust of the earth and Eve from his side and so forth, but they are created de novo in the literal way, but that their genetic material becomes mixed with the other population, and so we are all genealogically, every human alive is genealogically descended from Adam and Eve. I think that's a possibility, even though I'd reject Somidas's view that Adam and Eve lived much later than the first people. So that's kind of my take on those questions.
And what's your thoughts on kind of the push towards the evolutionary creationism, or kind of like the theistic evolution stuff that's becoming more debated over and over? You know, some are just like, look, I've been forced to believe a specific creation model my whole life, you know, this certain kind of creation model, and then I go to college and I get confronted with all the evolutionary stuff, and now I've got a crisis in my faith. Actually, I've seen it at a high state a few times, not all the time, but I've seen it happen. And then they need an alternative. And so, you know, some of these people come along and say, well, you know, somehow we can work these together. I mean, they're not incompatible. God uses evolution as a mechanism to accomplish his purposes. It's not that, you know, there's no desire behind it. That's just the mechanism he used. But it opens all kinds of other questions up, you know, other issues, you know. So where do you see that debate headed, and what are your issues with, like, if someone comes to you and says, well, I'm an evolutionary creationist, like, what is that? Or theistic evolution, like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so as I said, I think there are theological problems with that. And usually theistic evolution is understood not simply as common ancestry, but as the idea, or as the rejection of design, and the idea that you can have evolution that's fully explained by naturalistic mechanisms, but then God is somehow involved in some mystical way in the process. And it's a form of fideism, where, you know, God is there somehow in some sense, even though he takes pains to erase any traces of his activity in the world. And I think that's problematic. In terms of the motivation that compels many people to accept this evolutionary creationism or theistic evolution, whatever you want to call it, I think what I say to people who are in that situation, and I've talked to many people who've either lost their faith or been seriously on the verge of losing their faith as a result of being raised in these hyper fundamentalist conservative backgrounds, where they're basically told that either the earth is 6,000 years old, or Christianity is wrong. And then they go to college and they learn there's an avalanche of good reason to think that the universe is much older than 6,000 years. And so they throw the baby out with the bathwater and reject Christianity in toto, rather than simply revising their understanding, their interpretation of the early chapters in Genesis. What I tend to do when I talk to such people is I give them a number of what I consider to be plausible interpretations of the passages that they find concerning in the early chapters of Genesis, which have been offered by scholars and academics. And I offer those which I consider to be plausible. And then I will tell them, I will try to encourage them to think about, to think the issues through rationally, and think about the positive confirmatory evidences that in my estimation, compel belief in Christianity. And that should, at least, given that we have multiple plausible interpretations of the passages of concern in the early chapters of Genesis, that itself should provide some prima facie reason to think that there is some interpretation which actually is the correct one, that actually harmonizes with contemporary science, properly understood, and even if we don't yet know what it is. So that's normally how I counsel people in that situation. And I don't think that there's good scientific evidence that supports and substantiates the core claims of neo-Darwinian evolution. In fact, I would see the reverse to be the true. I think that the evidence is overwhelmingly against the sufficiency of naturalistic processes to account for the complexity of life. And even though I think that universal common ancestry is compatible with Christian theism, even if neo-Darwinian evolution is not, I nonetheless am skeptical from a scientific perspective, even of common ancestry as well. So that's what I'd say on that.
Okay, so so you would say that you have seen people have like that crisis, you know, that they've got to reconcile the Genesis. You know, I have more than enough books on my shelf on Genesis, and at this point in my life, it just seems to me that nobody agrees. So it just goes on and on. As far as you know, the debates on Genesis will go on forever. It never ends. So okay, so let's one last question, then we'll take some questions from people. So one thing that comes up sometimes is methodology, like what we call apologetic methodology. I know you know all about it. The different approaches we take to people and how we communicate to them about the gospel, how to answer their questions, where to deal with God's existence, how we approach it with people. And, you know, some people would say that you just need to always give people scripture, right? Scripture is what brings someone to saving faith in Jesus. It's powerful. It regenerates the unbeliever, which it does. I mean, there's no doubt it does. And some people would say, you know, that's all we need to give people. I mean, that's if they're dead in their sins, they need to be made alive and they need to hear the gospel. And of course, the Holy Spirit's one who convicts and does the regenerating, which we all believe he does. But the problem we get into with intelligent design arguments, some of the stuff we're talking about tonight, is that some people would say, skip that. Like, you don't need to, if you're talking to an atheist or an agnostic, you don't need to give them good design arguments or good evidence for design in nature, or what we call natural theology arguments using the Bible, you know, starting with the Bible. If someone doesn't believe the Bible is the word of God, it's very hard to start with them the authority of Scripture. Just like when a Muslim tries to convert me with the Quran, it's absolutely useless to me because I don't accept the Quran as an authority. So you can keep you know, give me passage after passage, I don't accept it because it's not authority. So do you think that some people maybe they look at intelligent design, and maybe in your experience they look and say, well, that doesn't really get to the design, it doesn't get to the God of the Bible, it doesn't provide saving faith, and so therefore we should just kind of ditch that and go right to Scripture? Do you ever run into that as far as methodology, from a methodological angle?
Absolutely. And I actually have a debate coming up this month on the 17th of July on the topic of apologetic methodology. And it's actually going to be a panel debate. It's myself representing evidentialism, and Dr. James White representing presuppositionalism, and then we've got Dr. Richard Howe representing classical apologetics, and we have Dr. Randall Rouser representing reformed epistemology. And I have grave concerns about presuppositionalism as an apologetic system. I think that it is very problematic philosophically and biblically. In terms of philosophical problems, first of all, it's circular. It basically argues that we have to start with the authority of Scripture rather than concluding with the Bible as being authoritative. And when you challenge the presuppositionalist on their circular reasoning, they typically respond by committing another logical fallacy, which is equivocation, which is basically when the terms change their meaning midway through the argument, thereby providing giving the false impression that the argument is valid when in fact it's not. And the equivocation on the part of the presuppositionalist is between presuppositions of so basically the argument first that they make is that everyone has to reason in some self-referential sense, because if you're using the laws of logic, well, how do you prove or demonstrate deduction without using deduction? And so there has to be a starting point at some point. There has to be some level of self-referentiality. Or circular reasoning, and they make this distinction between vicious circular reasoning and virtuous circular reasoning, and I disagree with that distinction. And I think that what they equivocate is presuppositions of first principles with presuppositions involving content. So to illustrate a presupposition of first principles, these are analytic statements which are true by definition. So the statement that let's take the statement that all bachelors are unmarried. Do we have to go and investigate that? No, we just need to analyze the constituent terms. The statement, all bachelors are unmarried, is true by virtue of what we mean by bachelor, what we mean by unmarried. And likewise, the statement, the laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction, the law of the excluded middle, the law of identity, are true by virtue of the definitions of the constituent terms. So it's definitionally true that A is not non-A at the same time in the same sense. Mathematical truth, likewise, it's definitionally true that 2 + 2 = 4 by virtue of what we mean by 2 + = 4. So, but then take a second statement like, so we looked at the statement, all bachelors are unmarried. Well, consider then the statement, all bachelors are unhappy. Well, that's a contingent statement. It might be true, but it also might be false. So we couldn't just analyze the constituent terms to find out. We'd actually have to go and start gathering evidence. So we'd never arrive at complete certitude as to whether the statement is true, because we might have missed a bachelor somewhere in our analysis. So that's, I think, where I'd want to make the distinction. Another area where presuppositionalists frequently equivocate is in their confusion of ontology and epistemology. So everyone, all the apologetic systems agree that God is ontologically necessary. That is to say that if God didn't exist, then there would be nothing that exists, right? And so the presupposition that the atheist, in that case, if God didn't exist, wouldn't have access to logic, sure, but they wouldn't have access to strawberries either, or anything that exists, because everything is ontologically dependent upon God for its existence. But what the presuppositionalist really needs to demonstrate is God's epistemological necessity. That is to say that the existence of God is necessary to know things about the world, and to reason and use logic and so forth. And that is never really demonstrated. So to illustrate, oxygen is ontologically necessary for one to verbally communicate, but it's not necessary for one to know this in order to verbally communicate. And so no Christian thinker would deny that God is ontologically necessary to account for all that exists in the world. But in presenting the transcendental argument for God, the presuppositionalists frequently lapse into presenting arguments for God's ontological necessity, when what he ought to have done is present arguments for God's epistemological necessity. And that's also a case of equivocation among presuppositionalists. Also, there's the issue of it's assumed by presuppositionalists that coherence is a sufficient ground for inferring truth. That if a worldview is consistent internally, and all other worldviews are inconsistent, incoherent, then therefore the one that's consistent must be true. But that's only the case if these are mutually exhaustive systems, and worldviews are presumably popping into being all the time. And so there's no reason to think that the worldview systems that exist are mutually exhaustive, and coherence is not a sufficient condition for establishing something is true. It also has to be demonstrated to correspond to reality. So even if it's the case that Christianity is internally consistent, and even if it's the case that all other worldviews are not consistent, then that doesn't demonstrate Christianity is true. I'm also not convinced that logic is that even if the transcendental argument holds, that only at best demonstrates the existence of God, not the truth of Christian theism. Also, I'm not even convinced the transcendental argument does hold, because the presuppositionalist likes to argue that that logic itself presupposes the existence of God, and I'm not sure I would agree with that, because logic can't not exist. I mean, the laws of logic are just true in every possible world. There's no possible world where the laws of logic wouldn't exist. So, and finally, one problem is what I call the problem of progressive revelation, which is to say that imagine you're a first century Jew, and you're living just when the New Testament is being written. Well, how do you know the New Testament is a legitimate continuation of what you have in the Hebrew Bible? Well, it doesn't seem to me that the presuppositionalist strategy would get you very far. You need to actually look at the evidence that's available. And I just don't see how a presuppositionalist model would really help there in establishing the New Testament as a legitimate continuation. In terms of the identity of the designer and ID, yeah, I mean, I hear that concern a lot, but also the cosmological argument or the fine-tuning argument don't get you as far as as establishing the identity of the designer. But nonetheless, even if and the biological design argument doesn't logically, I mean, it's not, there's no logical deduction from the evidence of biological design that God exists, let alone the Christian God exists, but it nonetheless does provide evidence that contributes to that cumulative case, because it greatly raises the probability that there is a God, and therefore raises in turn the probability of Christianity. And so even if there's no logical deduction from design to theism or to Christianity, it nonetheless is part of a cumulative argument to that conclusion.
Yeah, well, I always say that when people ask me about the existence of God, I always say, a lot of people always want God to speak to them directly or show up directly, appear to them. We know that's a misunderstanding, because they don't understand what God is to begin with, what his nature is. But I always say to them, you can look around the world at the created order, make inferences, cause-effect relationships. There's a designer behind natural feature, the natural features of the world, certain natural features are biological or cosmological or whatever, and that's kind of intelligent design somewhat. And then I talk about history after that. I always say those arguments won't get you all the way to God the Bible, no, but it's a starting point to see there is a God outside of the universe that is behind the natural world. And so, I'm not so against this thing of starting with step one, getting them to believe there's a God, then going to who Jesus is. I mean, now some people, if you can go right to Jesus and call it a day, and they already believe there's a creator. I believed in a creator when I wasn't an atheist, so all I had to hear was the gospel. I was ready. But some people, you have to start with step one. So that's what I was kind of getting. I think that's okay in our outreach and apologetics to start with that step one, which I think design arguments help in that. But some people are like, no, it doesn't get you all the God, the Bible. I was in the Creation Museum like 10 years ago in the Georgia, what's her name? Georgia, that works for them for Answers in Genesis. Anyway. Yeah, she was in the museum. She was in the bookstore, and I started talking to her about intelligent design, and she said, I don't like it because it doesn't identify the God of the Bible. It doesn't get people the God of the Bible. And I said, well, it seems to me that my first step is to get to people believing in a creator. Then historical apologetics will take over everything after that, as far as who Jesus is and getting into the resurrection. Like, I'm just getting them to step one, but she didn't like the methodology. So I was like, oh, well, whatever. Anyway. Okay. Well, that's a whole other issue. Well, let's take some questions now. Who wants to go ahead and ask Jonathan some questions? You know how this goes. If you don't start asking him questions, I will start asking Jonathan more questions. And that's what I do when speakers come on. If you don't start talking, I'm going to start asking Jonathan a lot more questions. There's a lot more I could ask him. So go ahead, whoever's got it, and let's go on the first one. Who wants to talk? Ask a question.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Jonathan. Thanks for being with us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
You gave us 7 categories in your evolution definition, and you talked about gradualism, but some years back, now this was a creationist that we had come to our church, but he mentioned something that was a little bit more popular called punctuated equilibrium, and so that is not gradualism. Is that not a thing anymore, or could you maybe explain a little bit about that, and if it's on the ropes?
Yeah, sure. That's punctuated equilibrium was a concept that was put forward by Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldridge. And yeah, it is a very popular idea. And when I said gradualism, I simply meant that evolution doesn't go suddenly from being a chimp-like ancestor to a human being. It's a very gradual process. Yes, there are times in evolution when, due to environmental events, evolution might happen more rapidly than other times, but that wasn't what I was getting at with that. It was simply to say that evolution happens very gradually, such that it's not that you have a chimp-like organism suddenly giving birth to a human being, or a fish suddenly giving birth to an amphibian, etc. It's a very gradual process. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a theory that proposes that once a species appears in the fossil record, the population becomes stable, showing like little evolutionary change. Like, what do they say, stasis?
Right, yeah.
So and I just didn't know if that's a popular, I mean, Frank Turek says that evolution is on the ropes as a whole, as a theory, but I didn't know like to what degree punctuated equilibrium is a part of what they're teaching today, or if that's
yeah it is. I mean, punctuated equilibrium is a popular idea. I mean evolution by natural selection is it's been substantially modified since it was first put forward by Darwin, of course, and we now understand much more about biology than was available in when Darwin was writing the Origin of Species. It was published in 1859, and then you've got Mendel also, who was the father of modern genetics, and he basically told us exactly how inheritance works, and then there was the contributions in population genetics, and then we learned a lot more about DNA, and we discovered the structure of DNA in 1953, thanks to Watson and Crick. And then in 1957, Francis Crick proposed that these chemicals called bases that run along the spine of the DNA molecule function as alphabetic characters in a written language, or digital characters in a machine code. And so we have a lot more knowledge now about the information in and how mutations work and so forth. And so that then evolution has been modified, the theory of evolution has been modified. And this during the 1930s and 40s, with scientists came up with what's known as the modern synthesis of neo-Darwinian evolution, often called neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, that's now recognized to be fraught with problems. There was a conference in 2016, which I attended in London at the Royal Society, where there were it was a gathering of many scientists who are in the field of evolutionary biology and recognizing weaknesses and shortcomings of the neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory, and in fact calling for a new paradigm. And actually the opening speech was by Gerd Müller, who's a very well-known evolutionary biologist, and he was talking about the things that evolution doesn't really, or at least the modern theory of evolution doesn't really account for. And basically it was everything interesting, right? And so they were calling for new theories to explain the origins of novelty, and they had people like James Shapiro advocating for his natural genetic engineering theory, and people who were advocating for evo devo and niche construction and so forth. And the processes that were discussed, and there's also several organizational theories and various flavors of neo-Lamarckism. And the theories that were discussed are all real processes. I mean, we're not saying that these processes aren't real things. But what was conspicuously lacking in the presentations was a demonstration that they actually explain what needs to be explained. I mean, bringing in new theories and new concepts and saying that they have to be they have to be part of what contributes to the theory of evolution is one thing, but actually demonstrating their sufficiency to explain what was the features that were deficient in the old paradigm is something else, and I don't think that was demonstrated. And for example, evo devo, it basically is shorthand for evolutionary developmental biology, and basically talks about how they basically emphasizes the importance of mutations in what are called cis-regulatory regions in the genome, and which basically determine how genes are expressed, and basically emphasizes mutations in Hox genes, which code for transcription factors, which are involved in regulation of gene expression, and if you mutate certain genes in a Drosophila, then you might get instead of a 2-winged fruit fly, you have a 4-winged fruit fly, because the balancers which are called halteres are replaced with a second set of wings, even though unfortunately these wings aren't connected to muscles or the brain, and so the fly is basically a cripple. You can also mutate another gene called antennapedia in a fruit fly and get legs growing out where the antenna should be. And so this has caused a lot of excitement in the evolutionary community, because maybe you could explain the substantial changes in body plan by mutations in these Hox regulatory regions of the genome. But actually the Hox genes are turned on relatively late in early development. So even though they're turned on early in development, the body plan by that point has already been established. So it's not really that helpful. And as I said, the fruit flies in those cases are hopeless cripbles. The 4-winged fruit fly can't exist outside the lab in the wild. It's a cripple because the wings aren't attached to muscles and the brain and so forth. That together with the fly with the legs growing out where its antenna should be it's just rearranged body parts in ways that are actually unhelpful. So even though these are real processes, they don't really explain what needs to be accounted for.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
That's. I wish I could have been at that conference, Jonathan. I heard about that. That would have been very interesting, but I'm not even qualified to be there. So anyway, who's next? Anybody? Next question? Yeah, Mitchell, go ahead.
So recently at Ohio State, I took a class on anthropology, and we focused a lot in the class on the story of how humans evolved from, less advanced kinds of organisms. So we talked about like the Australopithecines, and we talked about Homo erectus and the Neanderthals, and we talked about how we arrived at modern humans. So I was just wondering, specifically with respect to that story and with respect to that, the evidence surrounding it, I was wondering to what extent you agree with that, and to what extent you would disagree with that kind of model.
Sure, and I wouldn't claim expertise at all in this, because I am not a paleoanthropologist. But if you want a good book on it, by people who do have some measure of expertise in the subject, I'd recommend Science and Human Origins, which covers this in some detail. It's a popular level book. In terms of what I think, my understanding from what I've researched is that there are a lot of gaps in that transitional series, and a lot of the, I mean, I've been to the Cradle of Humankind in South Africa, where there's basically a museum showing some of these fossils and the skeletal remains that have been recovered. And often there's a lot of artistic license in constructing these skeletons, because the discoveries are often partial rather than complete. But the issue of common descent is not really my bone of contention, because, as I said, I think it's consistent and harmonizes fairly well with the biblical narrative, so long as you're not a gradualist or a neo-Darwinian. I don't really have a serious problem with common ancestry, so it's not been the locus of my attention. I'm more interested in, can evolution explain the appearance of design that we find in biology?
Thank you.
Okay, so Jonathan, would you kind of follow up to Mitchell's question? So are you arguing like for just a common designer kind of thing there? If there is some sort of common descent thing, just it's all under a common designer?
Yeah, so I think that there's a good case to be made for some limited level of common ancestry, at least. I tend to be more skeptical when talking about the grander claim of universal common ancestry. I'm not so sure the scientific evidence bears that out, and I think there's good evidence actually to question that. But in terms of more limited or modest forms of common ancestry, like common ancestry among primates, for example, I do think that the evolutionary biologists make a serious case that hasn't really been satisfactorily addressed by those who question it. So, for example, the argument that I find strongest for common ancestry among primates is the distribution of what are called endogenous retroviral elements within primate genomes. So primates have been on the scene for about 55 million years, and during that history, they've incorporated into their genomes basically infections by retroviruses, and often these retroviruses infect the germline, and the germline are the cell, or the genes, the DNA that gets passed on to future descendants, because they're found in the sex cells of the organism. And whereas the somatic cells, which are found in all of our other cells, are not passed on. So when these retroviruses infect the germline and they integrate into the genome, they can be passed on from generation to generation. And what's interesting is that they have this nested hierarchical distribution, or tree-like distribution, or resembling a family tree, and exactly the way you would expect if these organisms were descended with modification from common ancestors. What's more is that there's three core genes associated with retroviral sequences. They're called GAG, PO, and ENV. And these genes have also, and these basically code for the envelope proteins and the polymerase of the reverse transcriptase of the retrovirus, etc. And these genes have also incorporated point mutations, and the distribution of point mutations correlates with the nested hierarchical distribution of the actual distribution of the retroviruses. And so you've got this, there you've got two tiers. You've got the nested hierarchical distribution of the retroviral sequences in the primate genomes, and you also have a corresponding nested hierarchical distribution of the point mutations within the genes of those retroviruses. And then to add to that still, the retroviruses have what are called 5' and 3' long-term repeat sequences at each of the ends of the retrovirus. And these basically function in promoters and enhancers that are involved in gene expression. And they have to be identical at the point of integration into the genome. However, they subsequently incorporate mutations, and the degree of divergence between these two long-term repeat sequences in the retrovirus corresponds to, it can be used as a predictor of, the time since integration, which again adds a third tier to the argument for primate common ancestry. And I do think that the creationist side has really responded to that adequately. Typically, they will respond by saying that they're pointing out functions in retroviral sequences within the context of the human genome. For example, syncytin which is a protein that is responsible for holding together the syncytiotrophoblasts, which is essential for placental development, that is in fact coded for by the envelope gene in a retroviral sequence. But and the LTR, the long-term repeat sequences, seem to function in promoters and enhancers, but it seems to be the case that these were acquired after integration, since the hallmark of insertion by integrase is this characteristic target site duplication, which indicates that these really are genuine inserts. They're not, I think, intrinsic to the genome. Or sometimes the creationists would like to argue that there's a target site preference or preferentiality. I don't. I think there is a certain level of target site preference, but it's not anywhere near locus specific enough to explain the evidence away. And so I think the most parsimonious explanation in that case is in fact common ancestry rather than common design.
You know, when someone asks me if I'm a creationist, I always say, do you mean as opposed to like, do I believe undirected natural processes answers everything I see in reality? Of course I don't believe that's ridiculous. So yes, I'm a creationist if that's what you mean. You know what I mean? So it depends how you define creationist anymore either. You know what I mean? Because people think like young earth creationist, older creationist, but just to believe in a creator, I mean, over a naturalistic process accounting for everything you see, it's hands down, of course I'm a creationist in that sense. There's just no way I could ever believe that. Okay, who's next? Anybody? Any other questions? Anybody? Hello. Okay, I'm gonna ask Jonathan another question. I'm just gonna do it. All right, Jonathan, so, okay, Mitchell, go ahead. You came to the rescue.
I was just wondering, I mean, I know that you have had a lot of education over your years in school, specifically in the field of biology and evolutionary biology. I was just wondering, how is it for you as a Christian in that field? Did you ever get like, I guess, did people ever give you a hard time for that? Or what was that like?
That's a good question. Yeah, I have experienced challenges especially because of my ID connections and persuasions. So, for example, in and I've been I think more fortunate than some other people in my field, but I have had some situations. So, for example, in 2012, I was doing my master's program at the University of Newcastle in medical. At the time I was doing molecular microbiology. I actually switched to medical molecular bioscience as a result of this episode. But I had basically the way it works in the UK master's programs is that so I was doing a Master of Research, which I don't think you do in the US, but in the UK you can do either a Master of Science or a Master of Research, and a Master of Research is MRes, rather than MSc. And basically I was signed up. Basically they give you a form to fill in where you select your preference for a research project and your preferred supervisor and so forth. And then based upon your exam grades, you're entered into fair competition with the other students. And basically you've given your orders of preference, your first, second, third, fourth choice, etc. And depending on where you rank in the class, they will distribute those accordingly. So I got my first choice of project, which was with a particular supervisor, and we were going to be working on bacterial flagellar assembly in Colobacter crescentis, which is a bacterial genus, or bacterial species, Colobacter crescentis, which basically inhabits fresh water. And I met up with the supervisor to discuss the project. Everything was very friendly. He was impressed with my knowledge of the subject because it was a topic I'd read particularly much about. And we were excited to work together. And then about maybe a date had even been set for me to come start working in the lab on the project. And then about a week or two before I was due to start working, I received an email from the office of the dean of the graduate school asking me to come in for a meeting with the dean. So I did, and I was told that my supervisor doesn't want to work with me because, horror of horrors, he should have discovered that I think the life is the product of design. And I said, well, could maybe he come in to have a meeting with me personally so he can tell me this to my face rather than working behind my back like this. So the dean obliged and brought him in for a second follow-up meeting to talk to me in person. And he literally told me, and I'm virtually quoting him, he said that I could never have anyone working in my lab who took the view that life is designed, which is shocking to me. I mean, it had no relevance at all whatsoever to the project we were going to be working on. It wasn't, the project topic was nothing to do with evolution. And so I consider that to be rather intolerant behavior. And I think it's quite immature if a scholar says that he won't work with a scholar because he disagrees with them on some unrelated topic that has no bearing or relevance whatsoever to the project. So I haven't had any other issues of discrimination relating to ID. I did have one relating to my Christianity, although that wasn't in science, but it was at university, where I had I was on the chess team at the university. Well, I wasn't a regular player on the chess team, but I would occasionally fill in if they had a missing player, because I was busy with other things, and occasionally the team captain would say, "Hey, we're down a player. Would you mind standing in and playing for us?" So I was doing that from time to time, and I was scheduled to be playing in a particular match for the chess club, and about a few days before I was supposed to be representing the club at the chess match, I posted a link to an article on Facebook written by someone else criticizing the LGBT movement, and I got literally banned from participating in the chess team because I posted a link to an article written by someone else criticizing the LGBT movement. And then I complained to the Students' Union about this case of discrimination, and they took the side of the chess team for posting a link to an article by someone criticizing the LGBT movement. So there's a couple of instances.
Wow.
I'm not shocked at all, really. Yeah, but Jonathan, with your intelligent design, that's a very controversial issue. There's a lot of pushback on that. So I'm sure you've had to have pushback, right? People just in general, like, oh, intelligent design just gets so much pushback from other scientists and other people, right? I mean,
yeah,
just in general.
And unfortunately, though, I find that most people working in biology, unless they're evolutionary biologists, they don't really know a lot about evolutionary theory. And this actually came up in my discussion with the supervisor who refused to work with me. And when I started talking about the field of evolutionary biology, he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, it's not my field," meaning that he doesn't actually know the field that well of evolutionary biology. And yet he was so adamant about it that he wouldn't work with someone who took a different perspective on a field that he doesn't know much about. So that was quite revealing. And I've talked to other scientists, over dinner and so forth, informally about evolution, and even ones that are very committed to it don't really have a strong knowledge of the literature in the field, and aren't even aware of the challenges to evolutionary theory. So I think that a lot of the supposed consensus among biologists in terms of the efficacy of the Darwinian mechanism, a lot of the people that contribute to that supposed consensus don't actually know a lot about the subject and don't even know the criticisms. I even know people who aren't evolutionary biologists who don't know about the relevant issues pertaining to the debate over ID and evolution. So I would argue that it's not an informed consensus against ID, but a misinformed consensus.
Right. Not shocking at all. Anybody else have a question? Got about 10 more minutes. Anybody else? Okay, I'm gonna ask another question.
I have
All right,
question.
answer the question, Jonathan.
Eric.
What, you got one?
Yeah, I have
Go
another
ahead.
question.
Okay, Mitchell,
So
you keep bailing me out. Go ahead.
I've watched some of your debates on YouTube and different interactions you've had online that are public. So I was just wondering if you had a favorite one of those that you look back on and think, gee, that was a good interaction or a good discussion that we had.
That's a good question. And there could be different contributing factors to what would go into that. So it depends what the relevant factors are. In terms of one of my favorite debates was the debate with Peter Atkins in January, because it was just funny. but because he's extremely arrogant and condescending, and yet he doesn't really know that much about the subjects he's debating on. And also I was able in that debate to extract some concessions from him, which I think were quite revealing. Also, let's see, in terms of really substantive debates, in terms of quality of a debate opponent and substance of dialogue, I really appreciated my debate with Yusuf Ismail on the Trinity in the Old Testament, because I thought that he was very well prepared for that debate. And we actually had a very substantive and good interaction on that. I also, for that matter, appreciated my debate with him on the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. I thought we had a good discussion on that too. I also really appreciated my recent debate on the resurrection of Jesus on the Inside Story, which is available on YouTube. I debated with, it was a panel debate with two on each side, myself and Dr. Max Baker-Heitch, versus a guy called Harry Amos and another guy called who has a YouTube channel called Apologia. And that was, I think, a very substantive discussion. I thought our opponents were well prepared, and we had a very good and informative discussion.
Thank you.
Jonathan, Peter Atkins, I saw him debate Hugh Ross on Unbelievable, and he admitted pretty much no evidence would count as evidence. So that pretty much was the end of that discussion. So anyway, that was very telling, I thought. So Jonathan, how do you answer the, I want to ask you a question. What is the best design argument? What's your favorite design argument? Is there one that really does it for you? Is just more of a cumulative case?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many to choose from. I'm not sure if I have a single favorite. I do like the argument from irreducible complexity. Even though
that one's not controversial at all.
Yeah. Even though that gets a lot of bad publicity, I think that the common criticisms of irreducible complexity are misguided. However, I do think that Behe's original formulation of irreducible complexity needs to be better nuanced. I think that his original formulation of it has certain vulnerabilities. For example, and really probably the best argument against it that I've encountered in my reading is what is sometimes known as a Muller two-step scenario, or the incremental indispensability view, it's sometimes been called, which is to say that you can render a system with the appearance of irreducible complexity by removing components that were so basically the Muller two-step model, the first step is add a component, second step is render it essential by modification or removal of other components. That was a popular objection that was put forward. Alan Orr, for example, made this argument in the early 2000s against Behe's concept of irreducible complexity. And then the other scenario is that is often put forward is the idea of co-option or acceptation, where you basically borrow components from other systems and make them contribute to your new evolving irreducibly complex system. I think that both these objections, I think the first objection is the most substantive objection, and I think that I think that it is a vulnerability of Behe's original formulation. However, you can, I think, get around it if you frame or nuance irreducible complexity the way I do, which is to define irreducible complexity not in terms of the structural components that are necessary or essential, but rather the functions that need to be performed. So, for example, if you imagine the mousetrap illustration that Behe puts forward, and you have the various components that are necessary. So you have the platform, and you have the spring, and you have the hold down bar, and the catch, and everything that's necessary in the staples to hold the trap together. And if any of these components is missing, you don't have a trap that works half as well as it used to, but one that's broken. Now imagine that you have that trap, and you were able to let's say duplicate the spring by some sort of gene duplication event or something. And now you have two springs. And so now you have a catch that you have a mouse trap that's more powerful and is able to catch rats, which are bigger than mice, even though it previously could only catch mice. So you have an evolutionary advantage. Now imagine the first spring, the original spring, somehow becomes modified or broken in some way. And now the second spring, although it was only at first helpful, is now essential, right? And but nonetheless, you still need something performing the function of the spring, right? Even if the identity of that spring changes, you still need something performing that function. So to give a biological example, in bacterial cell division, you have what's called the so basically in a rod-shaped bacterial cell, it will elongate to about double the original length, and then you'll have this assembly of Fitz-Z subunits along the division septum of the divided bacterial cell. And basically it constricts and bifurcates the cell into two daughter cells, but that Fitz-Z ring has to be tethered to the inner membrane, and it's done in gamma proteobacteria by three proteins. You've got Fitz-A, you've got Zip-A, and you've got Zap-A. And the Zap-A is not essential, but Fitz-A and Zip-A are essential. And except outside of the gamma proteobacteria, there is no Fitz-A, right? I'm sorry, there is no Zip-A outside of the gamma proteobacteria. So even though it's essential in the gamma proteobacteria, it's not essential outside of the gamma proteobacteria. So how do you accommodate that within the argument of irreducible complexity? Well, it turns out that a loss of Zip-A can be accommodated by elevated concentrations of Fitz-A, and that's the case, for example, in Bacillus subtilis does it like that. And even if the identity of the component performing the function of the tether changes, nonetheless you still need something performing the function of the tether. You could have when you understand irreducible complexity in terms of function, then you can accommodate things like you could have one protein that's performing two functions, even though in another system, two proteins are required to perform those two functions. Or you could have a single function that's contributed to by multiple proteins, whereas that's not the case in another system. So once you understand irreducible complexity in terms of the necessary number of functions, I think that you evade the vulnerability that it was otherwise susceptible to. I also really like the fine-tuning of the genetic code argument, the fact that the genetic code seems to be finally optimized for minimizations of error. So as you know, as many of you know, the genetic code is a mapping system between 64 different codons, which are triplets of nucleotides, three-letter words called codons, and there's 20 different amino acids that are used in proteins, and the genetic code is basically a translation system for translating the sequences of ribonucleotides from the RNA transcript to the protein. And it's the genetic code seems to be finally optimized for minimization of error, and actually seems to be multiple levels of fine-tuning of the genetic code. But how would you evolve a genetic code by mutation and selection? Because if you modify the codon to amino acid mapping, then you're modifying every polypeptide that's made by the cell, which would wreak havoc. And also Hubert Yockey, who's a biophysicist, has estimated that to arrive at the conventional code found in nature, assuming all the time since the Big Bang, how many, which is about 10 to the 15 or 10 to the 16 seconds, how much time would it require to, how many genetic codes per second would you require to stumble upon the conventional code found in nature? And he estimates about 10 to the 55 codes per second since the Big Bang. And so given the genetic code doesn't seem to be much substantially evolvable, and it's multiple levels of fine tuning, and the fact that even if it was evolvable, you wouldn't have the probabilistic resources to search through all the combinatorial possibilities, that seems to me to point very powerfully towards design.
Okay. I think my favorite argument is that genetic information theory argument Stephen Meyer uses, kind of similar, what you're talking about, at least anyway. Okay. Anybody else have maybe one more question, or anybody else want to ask a question, or one or two more quickly? Anybody?
I can ask one other one.
Oh, okay.
Jonathan, did you sign the Descent from Darwin page? Is that what it was called?
I haven't actually. I actually just got my PhD in January, and you need a PhD.
Congratulations.
But I haven't decided whether or not to sign it at this point, because it does have career implications. But I'm already widely known in the ID community, so it probably wouldn't do me much more damage at this point if I were to design it. So I'm not sure, but so far I have not.
Okay.
Good question. Anybody else? One more?
So, John, on a practical level, I've appreciated you tonight, man. Really, really cool. On a practical level, like as far as having a PhD in this world, in the academic world, you're talking about career implications. Like, what does that look? You talked a little bit about that, but what does that look like? What's the reality right now? Because it seems like I'm seeing like Christians are being hired a little bit more now than they probably were like 10 years ago or something. So I don't know. What's your thoughts on it?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't. I'm not sure. I haven't kept up with or haven't looked much into whether Christians are being hired more now than they were 10 years ago. So I'm not sure the answer to that. In terms of getting a PhD, I think it's very useful in the sense that it opens a lot of doors to you that were otherwise closed, and often journals require you to have a PhD in order to publish, or yeah, it just opens doors that were otherwise not open, and people take you more seriously as a scholar if you have a PhD. I don't think it should be that way, because you can you can have decent things to say even without a PhD, but unfortunately it is. Does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what I've heard. It opens more doors. It can't hurt you, that's for sure. But anyway. Okay, and Jonathan, what about the God of the gaps argument, which you heard only 1,000 times, right? Is that something that you get sick of hearing? People bring that up?
Yeah, it is a bad argument, and here's why. Intelligent design is not an argument based on what we don't know about the cause and effect relationships, but it's what we do know. Namely, and intelligent design is based on the standard, historical abductive method of inferring to the best explanation from multiple competing hypotheses, which is the method that's used in the historical sciences. So we can't repeat the past in the laboratory, and so we have we use our present experience of the cause and effect structure of the world to guide our search for the best explanation. And there is a habitual association between design. There's a habitual association between information content, especially in digital form, and conscious activity or design or intelligence. And so when we find information intrinsic to the registry molecules of DNA and RNA, the best explanation is that it arose by means of an intelligent cause. It's a positive argument. So whatever else might be wrong with intelligent design is not wrong because it's got the gaps argument, because it's actually making a positive argument, even if there's something else wrong with the argument. Another way to frame the argument is in Bayesian terms, to say, well, is it more? Okay, so we observe information in life. Is that, and we observe a genetic code, a language and translation system. Is that more probable given the hypothesis of design or given the hypothesis of chance and necessity? Well, obviously, it's not wildly improbable given the hypothesis of design, because we see designers do that all the time. But it is wildly improbable given the hypothesis of chance and physical necessity. And therefore, it is Bayesian evidence, strong Bayesian evidence in favor of design. And so it's not the God of the gaps argument.
So can you quickly define though what people mean when they say God of the gaps, and we'll close it? Just when I say God, make sure everyone knows what we mean.
Yeah, sure. So this is a popular objection that the intelligent design is kind of a placeholder for that of which we are ignorant. And and it's basically saying we can't explain feature X, and so we'll just plug in God or the intelligent designer as a placeholder for that of which we're ignorant. And then as science advances, the argument has to shrink with each new advance in scientific discovery. And there's a parallel fallacy which is committed by many in the Darwinian camp, which is the Darwin of the gaps fallacy, which is to say that when we find alleged cases of suboptimal design, which seem to be designed inefficiently or suboptimally, and there's plenty of cases that have been given for that, such as the inverse wiring of the vertebrate retina and the recurrent laryngeal nerve in the neck of the giraffe and so forth. That's often made as an argument against design, that why would God have done it that way? But it's basically saying, well, we can't think of an explanation for why God would have done it that way, therefore we'll just plug in Darwin as kind of a placeholder for that of which we are currently ignorant. And then as science advances and discovers why the designer made them the way he did, then that argument has to retreat with each new advance in scientific discovery. And in fact, that has been the case for many instances of alleged suboptimal design, including the inverse wiring of the vertebral retina. And furthermore, even if we do have examples of demonstrated suboptimal design, the question is that more probable on the hypothesis of design or on the hypothesis of Darwinism? Well, it seems that even if it's improbable on the hypothesis of design, it's still far, far more probable on design than it is on non-design. And so therefore, it's still evidence of design over non-design. So,
right. Okay. Well, it's been great. Certainly, we talked about a lot of stuff, covered a lot of ground. I just want everyone to understand, once again, we tried to stay on intelligent design tonight. I'm well aware that many Christians have different creation models they hold to. I have plenty of my friends that are young earth creationists. I have friends that are old earth creationists. You know, there's gap theory. There's just all kinds of creation models out there. I mean, I know the two most popular ones are generally the young earth creationist view and old earth creationist view, but tonight we try to kind of stay on the intelligent design end of stuff, on the design arguments. And so that's where we, you know, if you're more interested in like creation models, there's plenty of books out there you can read. All the different schools of thought have their books and arguments for and arguments against. I have 4 views on creation. I have intelligent design, young earth creationist, old earth creationist, and evolutionary creationist, all in one book. You can get that online, 4 views. So many books out there, more reading, there's enough to learn. So, well, Jonathan, we just want to thank you for your time. Congratulations on your new position teaching. I know you've got a lot going on, but I know it's exciting. Congratulations on, you know, new family and getting married and everything. I know you've got a lot going on in your life, and we just appreciate you taking the time. Now, Jonathan, what is your website if people want to go learn more about you?
So my website is jonathanmclatchie.com. So you can go there. You can contact me there. I also have a blog there. There's also links to my latest videos on YouTube there.
Yeah, I can type it in here. Yeah, Jonathan McLatchie, he's got a ton of YouTube videos too. You can find all his debates online and everything. So, well, Jonathan, I'll be looking forward to that debate you're doing on apologetic methodology, because that's an important topic to me. And being that I'm a Southern evangelical grad, I do think classical apologetics has a lot of weight to it, and evidentialism, of course, are kind of, you know, somewhat similar, but you know, there's some overlap there. So I'd probably like to see that debate. I look forward to seeing that. When's that again, that debate you're doing, apologetic methodology?
That's on the 17th.
And that's just an in-house debate, between other, you know, Christians.
Right.
So it's not like you and 2 atheists. So that's
yeah.
Interesting. Know all that, James White. Yeah.
The YouTube channel for that is Explain Apologetics. If you go over to my Facebook page as well, you'll find the flyer there and details. So it's on apologetic systems, and it's just a friendly 4-way discussion, trying to hash out some of our differences. Obviously, Richard Howe and myself are much closer to each other than anyone else is to one another, because Richard Howe is classical and I'm evidentialist, and we all have very minor and principal differences, but actually probably don't make that much practical difference at the end of the day.
I can tell you that evangelistically, you're doing apologetics on a college campus, apologetic methodology does matter. It does play a role in like how you approach people. I mean, not that you're looking at them as like you look at them as people, of course, but I mean, still how you approach them. So it does play a role, and I know what I do. So, and what some of us do here. So,
yeah, for sure.
All right. Well, listen, thank you, Jonathan, again, and blessings to you. And like everyone, like you said, you all can go find out more information about his website. And Jonathan, once again, thank you, and be blessed in your new job, and hope to see you again.
All right. Well, thank you.
Okay. God bless you. Take care.
Bye.
We'll stay on after this. Let me just go ahead. You're fine. All right. Let me stop here.